Greco-Roman astronomer Ptolemy identified a place called Saban in the 2nd century. The earliest written record of Singapore was a Chinese account from the 3rd century. This was an epic poem written in 1365 to a settlement on an island named Temec, also known as Seatown, the seaport. Legend has it that the Prince of Savagia landed on Temec during the 13th century when he saw a strange beast said to be a lion. He ran with that suspicion and named the settlement Singapore, which means Lion City. In 1320, the Mongol Empire sent a trade mission to a place called Dragon's Teeth Gate, also known as Long Yameng. This would be Capel Harbor, which is located at the southern part of the island. Wang Dynasty visited in 1330 described Dragon Teeth Gate as one of the two distinct settlements from Malay to Mek, the other being Fort Canning Hill. Recent excavations found evidence that Singapore was an important settlement in the 14th century, but in the 14th century, Singapore was caught in a struggle between Thailand and the Java-based Majapahit Empire for control of the peninsula. According to Malay annals, Singapore was defeated in only one Majapahit attack. Not too long after that, the Malacca Sultanate extended authority over the island and Singapore became part of it. In 1511, according to Alfonso de Albuquerque, the Portuguese seized Malacca and the Sultanate escaped south to establish the Johor Sultanate, and then Singapore would become a part of that. The Portuguese, however, destroyed the settlement in Singapore in 1613, and the island sank into obscurity for the next 2 centuries. Between the 16th and 19th century, Malay was gradually taken over by European colonial powers, which were known as the Portuguese. The Dutch challenged the Portuguese for dominance during the 17th century. The Dutch came into control of the ports in the region. They would establish a monopoly over trade, and colonial powers such as the British had minor presence. Stanford Raffles was appointed as lieutenant governor of the British colony. He was bent on establishing a new port, one to challenge the Dutch and two to get away from paying such high tariff on trade. Raffles would arrive in Singapore in 1819 and chose this as the new port. In his findings on the island, he discovered a small Malay population of about 1,000. This population was led by Temenggong. Raffles came to a payment agreement with Temenggong, which allowed him to establish a port on Singapore. Soon after Singapore became a British settlement, population rose. More Chinese, Malaysian, Indian, and other parts of Asia began to come in. With the growing population of the port, Singapore skyrocketed over the years. During that time, Raffles' return had been cooling and left William Farquhar in charge. Even though the port was bringing the desired revenue, Farquhar had his own way of doing things. Raffles returned to Singapore in 1822 and became very critical of Farquhar's decision, which was selling license for gambling, sale of opium, and slave trade. Raffles saw that as evil, so he drafted new policies banning slave trade, gambling dens, prohibition of carrying weapons, and a heavy tax on alcohol and opium smoking, later known as the Raffles Plan on Singer. Down the line, Raffles would replace Farquhar with John Crawford in 1823. Raffles departed from Britain and would never return. Fast forward a bit to the World Wars. World War I did not deeply affect Singapore, being that the conflict did not spread to Southeast Asia. The only significant local military event was during 1915, which was a mutiny with the British Muslim Indian sepoys after word went around that there were plans to send them to fight the Ottoman Empire. After the war, Britain began to build a naval base in Singapore, which was completed in 1939. In December 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor from the east coast of Malay. Japan's objective was to capture Southeast Asia and secure the rich supplies of natural resources to feed its military and industry needs. Commanders in Singapore believed that the attack would come from south by sea, which was tragic. It seemed as though nothing would go right. After the incident, Singapore and Malaysia suffered daily airstrikes which targeted civilian structures such as hospitals and shophouses. By January 31st, 1942, the Japanese had conquered the entire peninsula and were poised to attack Singapore. Allied forces in Singapore did try to stop the invasion by blowing up causeways linking Johor to Singapore, but the Japanese still managed to cross. This was the Battle of Pasir Panjang. Allies would become prisoners of war after the defeat. The fall of Singapore was the largest surrender of British-led forces in history. The Japanese inhabited the island and killed most of the population. In 1945, the Japanese surrender to the Allies of Singapore fell into a brief state of violence and disorder. In 1946, Singapore was more bent towards self-government. The Straits settlements were dissolved and Singapore became a separate crown colony. In 1947, separate executive and legislative councils were established, and the election of 6 members to the legislative council was scheduled in the following year. Councils continued to grow more and more over the years. In 1963, Malaysia and Singapore were merged. The merger was thought to bring benefits to the economy by creating a free common market and improve Singapore's international security. Then in 1965, they separated from Malaysia, becoming an independent state. Singapore joined the United Nations the same year, becoming the 117th member. This, to me, was the start of Singapore's new pathway. Yes, Singapore did go through its ups and downs, but in the 2000s, where we are now, today, it is an amazing place.